The ICC's arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin happens to have gone out on the 20th anniversary of the Iraq War. And to mark that anniversary, Mehdi Hassan spoke to former Chief Weapons Inspector for the UN, Hans Blix.
Tony Blair, they launched this war, like I said, on a platform of lies, and yet they faced no consequences for rushing ahead without even confirming that WMDs existed, ignoring your advice. You dealt with them directly. You met with them. You tried to persuade them. Looking back now, should they have faced some consequences for the disaster that is Iraq?
Well, in principle, yes. I think that has been felt ever since the First World War. And after the Second World War, you had, of course, the Nuremberg tribunals. And now, with the Russians invading Ukraine, you have many people acting to set up collection of evidence for some kind of trials after the end of the Ukraine war. So I think that the principle, the rule in the United Nations Charter that you are not allowed to use force against territorial integrity and independence of other states, that should have, of course, a corroboration in a penalty rule. That if you
You mentioned principle. Obviously, in reality, in real life, it's not going to happen. But I'm just wondering, in theory, in principle, are you saying that you would have liked to see a George Bush, a Tony Blair, put in front of The Hague like any other person who has defied, violated international law, accused of committing war crimes?
I think in principle, yes. And I think that even they would not come, and nor would Putin come before a tribunal. But nevertheless, holding the tribunal, going through the evidence, I think would be of value, yes. And we hear very much from the Western world about the rule-based international order. Now, that is the one that the US and UK and the others broke in 2003.
So that was Hans Blix. He was the UN Chief Weapons Inspector. And that was, you might remember him from the news in 2003 because he was the person who was doing the inspecting in Iraq. America and the UK were saying, no, they're not letting the inspectors do their work, so we're going to have to invade them. Hans Blix was saying, no, don't invade them. We are still having a good go at doing this inspecting that we were supposed to be doing. They were obviously ignored, and now Hans Blix, 20 years later, in that interview, I'm sure he said it in the interim as well, sort of saying, yes, that act by George Bush and Tony Blair to say, screw the UN, screw the weapons inspectors, we're going to invade, that should have put them, not necessarily in front of the International Criminal Court, but in front of some other international tribunal. Obviously, as we've been speaking about, America isn't a signatory to the ICC, so it'd have to be some sort of ad hoc tribunal. Aaron, what did you make of that?
That was gold dust, Michael. What a get from Mehdi. Last week he was speaking to us here at Novara Media, now he's speaking to Hans Blix, saying that Blair and Bush should stand trial for what was an illegal war of aggression. It's something we said right at the start of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Michael. What Russia has done to Ukraine is an illegal war of aggression. It's illegal under international law. Since 1945, it's been called the supreme breach of international law because there is no greater war crime than a war of aggression, which is to infringe and invade the territorial terrain. It's to infringe their territorial sovereignty by armed force, which is what precisely we did in Iraq with the United States. We were not the good guys. And I do find it remarkable. It was the exact same thing. It was the exact same breach of international law that Russia is doing with Ukraine. It's not the same thing because, of course, they're neighboring, there's historic context, which is different, etc. But from an international law perspective, it is the exact same thing. It's the precise same thing. And it is extraordinary that the people flying Ukraine flags and so on, good for them. My wife has a pair of Ukraine socks somebody kindly bought for her. Great. Why do people care so much? Because what's happened is evil, and many people are dying and suffering as a result of an illegal war of aggression. We did the exact same thing in Iraq. We did the precise same thing in Iraq. This is not whataboutery, because we're now talking about 20 years after that invasion. Many, many people died as a result. It's not whataboutery. We've got Alistair Campbell, the comms guru from one of the primary perpetrators, Tony Blair, doing podcasts, saying, on reflection, how do we think about it? Well, let's reflect properly. Let's have your boss have to answer some questions in front of The Hague. That's reflection. And it's important to say, Michael, this is not prejudging anything. The exact same point has been raised with regards to Putin and the ICC. He has clearly questions to answer. Clearly. That's the point of a trial. I'm not saying send Blair to prison, although that may happen, right? clearly there are questions to answer in regards to breaches of international law and the war in Iraq. That's what Hans Blix is saying. He's a very eminent man to do so. And by the way, Hans Blix was not some radical. This guy, prior to becoming a diplomat and working for the UN, was a member of the Swedish Liberal Party. He wasn't even a social democrat, let alone, somebody on the left. So this is sensible, moderate politics to say that, yes, guess what? The whole point of international law is that it applies to everyone. It's not just a cudgel with which the West can beat other people, other lesser countries. By the way, it can't even get the big boys like China and Russia. It's just small fry, like Slobodan Milosevic or Saddam Hussein. Let's be real. That's what it is. I would like it not to be that, but that's what it is. And it's not just Hans Blix who said this at the time. In the early 2000s, Kofi Annan, who was the UN Secretary General, said this was an illegal war of aggression. This is nothing new. And often when you say this in the UK media, people say, how could you say it's ridiculous? It wasn't illegal. The Attorney General said it was legal. I don't think it's down to the Attorney General. Okay? And you can say it's legal. Somebody else can say it's illegal. That's the point of a trial. We find out who's right.
I imagine that whatever is the Russian equivalent of the Attorney General has also said their invasion of Ukraine is legal, right? You can't say, oh no, our Attorney General said... By the way, also our Attorney General originally said it wouldn't be legal without a UN resolution. And then, suspiciously, magically, when they couldn't get a further UN resolution, changed their mind. Like, oh no, actually, maybe I've reread the evidence. Potentially, we could invade Iraq and it wouldn't be illegal. I mean, clearly it was, right? Aaron, I want your thoughts, I suppose, a bit more on this 20th anniversary of Iraq. I mean, you were talking there about Hans Blix sort of being a moderate, this is not some radical speaking here. And I suppose, I think a somewhat related point is you hear, like I've actually, for my sins, I've listened to the first half of this Alistair Campbell podcast where he's talking about the Iraq War. What he's always says, you've got to put yourself in our shoes, right? You've got to put yourself in our shoes. There was a real heightened security threat. We really felt like Saddam had done all this. And it's easy to say in hindsight, et cetera, that we shouldn't have invaded them.
What had Saddam done?
Will he talk about gassing the Kurds sort of 20 years previously, et cetera?
But Michael, this, absolutely true. There was a heightened sense of security threat after 9/11. And then we invaded the most secular regime in the Arab world. You fucking idiot, Alistair. Do you really believe that after 20 years? I don't think you do. Because you're not an idiot. You're a smart man.
Well, the other thing he says is, the point I was going to make, I agree with you there, is that he's sort of saying, you've got to put ourselves in our shoes. It's easy to say with retrospect, et cetera, et cetera. But everyone realized at the time, right? So there were 2 million people marching in London, but there was also France, Germany, Russia, the UN. All of these organizations were saying, don't go in. One, this is illegal. Two, it's crazy and it's only going to end in, terrible outcomes. And then you've got sort of like Alistair Campbell in this podcast, he's saying, it was remarkable. You had George W. Bush who was saying to Tony Blair, you've got to persuade Dick Cheney that we need to go to the UN. And Alistair Campbell saying, this, we were a real force of moderation. It's like, who the forces of moderation were? It was France, it was Germany, it was Russia. It was these countries saying, don't do it, right? So we could have been a force for moderation by saying, don't do this crazy illegal thing. That's what the majority of countries in the world were saying. We decided, no, we're gonna try and make war a little bit nicer than it otherwise would be. The reason a war of aggression is the supreme war crime, the war crime which is above all others, is because it's what all the other ones stem from, right? So if you enact a war of aggression, maybe you haven't said some of the nasty things that Vladimir Putin has said. Maybe there isn't evidence of sort of, although there is evidence of pretty goddamn bad stuff when it comes to those wars in the Middle East. I think the defense that they would make sort of in the West is, we do talk to lawyers when we're operating our war aims, for example, in a way that Vladimir Putin presumably doesn't. But if you've overthrown a sovereign leader, if you've done regime change, if you've invaded a country, with no justification in a legal way, and chaos ensues, then you can't say, oh, we were well-intentioned when millions of people die because you completely disrupt and break down the social order of an entire region of the world. Right? So it just seems to me completely bonkers. And I don't think, Aaron, everyone, the majority of people recognize the Iraq War was a mistake, but I still don't think as a society we've had a proper reckoning with quite how much damage, how much human suffering we have created in the rest of the world from that one decision.
No, we don't. I honestly don't know how Tony Blair sleeps. People talk about Sure Start. We create the conditions for ISIS to emerge. What the hell are you talking about? That's not flippant, by the way. And if you're neoconservative and you're on the right, we also, Britain and the United States also put Iranian influence in Iraq on steroids. There is no argument for it. I think about some of the people you just mentioned there, Michael. There were voices arguing against war. At the time, the French foreign minister was Dominique de Villepin, very slick, very dapper. He argued against war. He's not a left-winger. Centre-right politics. Chirac was a centre-right president. It wasn't some anti-war. It wasn't Jean-Luc Mélenchon. And de Villepin argued against it, and now he owns like a business. He owns like a clothes shop with his son. Compare that to Blair, Michael. This foaming at the mouth warmonger who won't disappear from public life. He still has to be on TV every week. ID cards. Corbyn has to go. COVID. With his diktats and his consultancy fees from Kazakhstan to the Arabian Gulf. Give me Dominique de Villepin any day. Don't agree with him on much. I'm sure he's a conservative, but he took the right principled decision in the early 2000s, and now he's just retired from public life and he has a nice little shop with his son. I think his daughter. Good for him. That's a normal human being, not Tony Blair, a megalomaniac, who, by the way, somehow still is a cult, a point of reference for progressives in this country. Progressive. I like Tony Blair. You're progressive? Okay. I think it says something about the political sickness in this country that means actually we can't really address major problems going forward. Because our points of reference in recent past, from Blair to Thatcher, were causes of chaos in many ways, many ways.